From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
A major dam in Russian-occupied Ukraine is destroyed as the defending forces prepare to launch a counteroffensive. And meanwhile, in Washington, Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy spar over supplemental defense appropriations. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Jillian Melcher in London and columnist Kim Strassel. The video and images coming out of Ukraine have been harrowing for more than a year now, but the latest is water rushing out of a reservoir through the remains of a hydroelectric dam and pouring into nearby settlements. This is a humanitarian disaster. And Jillian, can you give us a sense of where this dam is, what the importance of it is, and what we know about what's happening on the ground?
Yeah, so this is a dam just outside of Kherson in southern Ukraine. It had about 18 million cubic meters of water. And this is, you said humanitarian disaster, and that's absolutely right. I mean, just in the short term, there are about 80 different settlements that are in the flood zone. But then you look at the longer term implications of this, the hydroelectric plant that's been flooded, 3 million people depend on it for electricity. And this is coming at a time when Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been under sustained Russian attack. This is also a dam that provided irrigation for farmers, water for about hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland. So there's concern about that drying up. Keep in mind that Ukraine is a major global food supplier and that Russia has weaponized that to try to, hurt countries that depend on it for crop exports. Just in the short term, you've got people wading through the water, trying to rescue elderly people, trying to rescue pets, houses submerged. The images of this coming out are really awful. But I think this is something that really is going to scar southern Ukraine for a long time.
The dam is also downstream of Europe's largest civilian nuclear power plant, which pulls water normally from that reservoir for cooling purposes. And there was some concern that if the water level fell too far, there could be a problem there. Energy officials are saying that that is probably not the case, that there is enough water on site in pools to continue the cooling for several months at least, as long as the Russian forces who are in control of that allow that to happen. Those reactors, I should note, also have been shut down. So they're not currently operating, but they're still pretty hot and require the water for cooling purposes. Jillian, nobody has claimed responsibility for this. Kremlin spokesman is saying that it is deliberate sabotage by the Ukrainian side. Ukraine's president is saying that the dam was mined by the Russian occupiers and they blew it up. American officials, at least the latest I've seen, are saying that they're investigating, trying to gather some more information, but not making any definitive arguments yet. And then there's some interesting analysis, at least today, from experts in dams and munitions who are saying that this was probably an explosion that happened from the inside because a missile strike or something externally would not have caused the kind of severe destruction that we are seeing. But what's your read of this question on who is most likely to benefit here from the destruction of the dam and now the flooding that we're seeing?
I want to point out that Western officials are being right to be cautious here and to wait for the evidence to come in. But regardless of that, it's worth noting that Russia has a long history in Ukraine of playing fast and loose on serious safety issues like the nuclear power plants and doing things that are really dangerous and really likely to hurt civilians. I mean, look at the early days of the war, there's another reservoir that's north of Kiev called the Kiev Reservoir. This is something that could take out a lot of the city. And you actually had Ukrainian Air Force intercepting a missile that was headed toward it. So I think that's one thing to just keep in mind. In terms of incentives here, Ukraine is gearing up for a counteroffensive against Russia. This humanitarian catastrophe is going to require an enormous amount of resources to address. We're talking about evacuating thousands of people. It's hitting energy infrastructure that's already quite brittle in Ukraine. It's possible we don't know quite what the course of the counteroffensive is going to look like yet, but it's possibly going to complicate some efforts for Ukrainians to advance in certain regions of the South. And we already know that the South is a strategically very important region for Ukraine to strike. So, this certainly complicates things for Ukraine. I will also just point out on the Russian side, one of the things that has come up is that Crimea is dependent on this dam for drinking water. But I will also note that from 2014 till 2022, when Russia mounted its full invasion and claimed some of this territory, Crimea was able to get its water resources from somewhere else.
On the point about the counteroffensive, the Journal's news story on this today is pointing out that the flooding now could create what this news story calls an aquatic buffer zone for Russian forces that are on the southern bank there, and make the river, at least downstream for a good bit, pretty impossible for Ukrainian forces to cross. And that could allow Russia to redeploy forces and try to repel counteroffensive if it comes elsewhere. Jillian, can you give us a sense of what we expect out of this counteroffensive and the balance of forces as we go into these next months of the fighting season?
Yeah, you bring up the dam and the flooding, and I think you're absolutely right on that. Water crossings are a really difficult thing to do militarily, because if you are able to successfully get across, you're basically cut off in a way from your supply lines that are supporting your operations. So it's tough under any circumstances. This body of water being bigger right now, not helpful to Ukraine. So that's kind of the buffer issue. I think right now you see Russia occupying large swaths of southern Ukraine and eastern Ukraine. And so kind of the question is where the Ukrainians will try to push down and force the Russians back. They've been quite tight-lipped about that. So we don't really know yet. One thing that's come up a lot is Ukraine still wants to recapture all of its territory. That includes Crimea. So one thing that I'd be keeping an eye out for is Ukrainian strikes on the Kerch Bridge. That's the bridge that connects Crimea and Russia. We've already seen one attack there that damaged the bridge, but the goal would be to cut Crimea off from Russia. And then Ukrainians potentially targeting that land route along southern Ukraine that also supplies Crimea. That's one thing I'd possibly be keeping an eye out for. Another would be Ukraine's really been investing a lot in drone technology. We've seen some really innovative uses of drones, and I'd say that's something that we're quite likely to see a lot more in the next round of counteroffensive. Now, on the manpower question, you saw the Battle of Bakhmut, both sides suffering very heavy casualties, but really the Ukrainians grinding down Russian troops, just imposing significant deaths, significant number of wounded Russian soldiers. Ukraine's population is a lot smaller, but at the same time, the Russians have to worry about, now that they are under sanctions and have a finite supply of weaponry, they have to basically produce it in-house or get it from Iran. Ukrainians are getting armed by the West, so that frees up some of the workers that you'd normally need for manufacturing capacity to go in and actually fight. So that's one way that disparity is being addressed. Another is you see a lot in Ukraine, at least, a lot of female soldiers joining the fight.
But it seems to me that Western observers have high hopes for this Ukrainian counteroffensive. And one aspect of this is reports of infighting among the Russian troops and Russian mercenaries on the front lines, the Wagner Group. Apparently, in recent days, the Wagner Group posted a video of a captured Russian soldier and complaining that they were being fired upon, friendly fire there. And Kim, the other thing I would point out is that time is not necessarily on Ukraine's side here, because Vladimir Putin's hope has been that Western interest in this conflict and support for the Ukrainian defenders would flag as time went on. And I think he's been disappointed in the resolve that the West has shown so far. But that's not guaranteed to continue. And meanwhile, it's Ukraine's dams and cities that are being destroyed.
Yeah, and that has to be factored in as we are looking at the question of culpability here. I agree with Jillian that we have to be careful while the experts are looking at this, but there's a lot of reasons why Russia would benefit from doing that, and this is one of them, especially as we've been talking about this counteroffensive for a long time. And one real big belief was that this might be Ukraine's first move, was to try to cross at this river and cut off Crimea and this land bridge, because that would be an enormous blow to Russia. Look, we've got lots of stories out there about how Russia is suffering its own problems here. They're essentially having to engage in forced conscription to get soldiers. We've got the Wagner division at the moment, and the claim by its leader that he and his forces are now out for several months. We'll see if that changes. But Russia's got every reason at the moment to start really causing mischief. And I think that that's actually the thing that should be most concerning in the wake of this dam, is that if it was Russia that did this, it kind of indicates the degree to which it's getting a little desperate, and it's going to start engaging in activities that aren't necessarily about fighting, but about sabotaging different parts of the country as a way to slow down Ukrainian forces and buy itself some more time on this counteroffensive. Because we've been hearing again for a long time just how important this counteroffensive is, because if it can turn the tide of the war, you strengthen Western resolve. You continue to convince countries to keep supporting all of this. If it's a failure, who knows where that goes? And you know that all of that is on Putin's mind.